All right, today we want to start talking about sandpapers. We're going to use sandpapers to make our wood smoother and better looking, get rid of imperfections and defects. Sandpapers are generally a paper or other type of material with an abrasive grit glued to it. And these are a few variety of samples here, but the grits are made from a few different things. A few of them are made from natural stones. So here we have a piece of sandpaper that is flint, F-L-I-N-T, flint. It's a natural stone. Or here we have one orangish one that's called garnet, another natural stone. But then they also started making some ones that are a little more resilient, that last a little bit longer. The chemist came up with a few things. Here is one called aluminum oxide. Aluminum oxide. This is good for kind of coarse and medium grits. It tends to have a brownish color, or sometimes red, if they add the red color into it. And then there's also one here called silicon carbide. So this one is a very fine, very smooth paper, not very rough, silicon carbide. Okay. Manufacturers come up with the numbering system on our sandpapers, because these are different grits. This is a 600 grit. This is an 80. These are both 80s. And this is a 100. Okay. The numbering system is based on the amount of holes per an inch in a screen that they use to get the different size grit. So if it has a screen with real big holes, the big pieces are going to come through. You're going to get bigger, chunkier grit. If it is a screen with small holes, only very small pieces are going to come through. This will be a much smoother, finer sandpaper. So the numbering system is how many holes there are in that screen over an inch. So that 600 grit is very, very small holes. So only the finest little dust gets through. Whereas the 80 grit is quite a bit rougher, and you get the real big chunks through. So they want the ones that are just about that size. Okay. So that means the larger the number, the smoother the sandpaper is. Here's our 600 again. Doesn't really look like it has any texture on it. And the smaller the number, the rougher the sandpaper is. Okay. Here's one. This is a pretty rough grit here. You can see the texture on it. That's from when they were resurfacing the floors. Here's some 60 grit, so smaller 60 grit versus our 600. Okay. And sandpaper is identified by a number followed by a letter, such as 60D, 80D, 100C, and 220A. Okay. The number means the size of the grit. The letter is referring to the backing material. Okay. This is a piece of 280A grit sandpaper. 280A has a very light, flexible paper. 280, a pretty fine, smooth grit. Whereas this is a piece of 80D, is a much stiffer, almost slightly cardboardy or cardstock backing. So this is for heavier duty weight work. It's going to last longer, not be as flexible for the details. Okay. And when looking at really rough grits, here we go. This is our 16 grit. So think about the screen for this one, how big those rocks that came through. This is a chunk off a disc that they redid the gym floors with when they grind off all the old finish. That's one of the first steps. So when we're looking at our grits, we start with the roughest, either our 60 or 80, and we start working up from there. So 60, 80, 100, okay, keep going up. Then when we're talking about what we're actually doing with sanding, the first step in sanding is to remove flaws or scratches. So here's our cutting board. It's a little tough to see, but it went through the planer. There's some bigger scratches on this. See some on this side. Okay, so our scratches, or we're looking for what are called mill marks. So what's happening with mill marks, it's hard to see them. You can see them lightly on here. They are coming across the board. They look kind of like lines coming across the board. Okay, so first step, we're removing scratches and deep flaws. Second step, first step, removing scratches and our mill marks. Right, our mill marks here. What basically happened is when this runs through a surface planer, right, the planer has a rotating drum. It makes these little, and this is exaggerated, but every time it spins by, it makes these little scoops. They look kind of like waves on the ocean. So there's all these little peaks and valleys. We want to even those out and sand off the peaks so it's all nice and flat. Okay. So once we get rid of that, we make it nice and flat. We still have some pretty big scratches in here. So then the second step is to make smaller and smaller scratches. As we use the different sandpapers, we're making the scratches smaller to the point where they become unnoticeable. And they just kind of blend in with the grain. What causes the mill marks to get on that wood? Generally our surface planer. Okay, a surface planer or a jointer that's causing those swipes through, making it slightly uneven. And like I said before, the mill marks, it's most easily identifiable. I rock it underneath a light and look for the reflection off of it, and I'm looking for lines kind of going across the grain. It's sometimes near the end of the board, a couple inches from the end, you'll get a big one. But then through the middle of it, it's generally you're looking for like a repetitive pattern. Wood's a natural product, so you shouldn't have anything as a repetitive pattern. If you do, that means that it was from a machine. So we want to remove that. So our mill marks are a repetitive pattern of lines going across the grain. If I don't remove the mill marks, when I go to put a finish on this, okay, they might be a little bit hard to see now. When I put a finish on it, it's going to make the mill marks even more noticeable. It makes them stand out. That unevenness takes in the finish a little bit differently and will make them very, very noticeable. And now when we go to start doing our sanding, it's very important that we sand the same direction as the grain of the wood. So remember before we talked about our face and our edge and our end. Well, our grain is going from this end to this end. So when we do our sanding, we want to sand the same direction back and forth as we go. We never want to sand across the grain. No, we never sand across the grain. Right? How could I tell if you did sand across the grain or somebody did? I'm going to give this a couple of swipes here. And then I think it might be even pretty easy to see. I rock this a little bit. We're going to see these deep scratches going across the grain. Whereas the opposite, if we're going with the grain, the scratches are blending in with the grain. It's going the same direction. It's not ripping the fibers apart, so they're not as very noticeable. So to fix this now, I need to resand this area, preferably with a lower grit, because those scratches are going to be hard to get out. If I actually did this with 100 grit or 120, I'd want to go back down to like an 80 grit. Okay. So then, I don't know if you saw, but I'm sanding a nice flat surface here. I don't want to just use my hand on here because that puts pressure in a lot of different places. Right? I want nice and evenness. So I want to use a small sanding block or a block of wood to hold it, create a nice flat surface as I go back and forth. So I want to use a sanding block. And now when I look at a finished piece, okay, you might be able to, think, oh, V, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't need to spend time with each sandpaper making smaller scratches. So say maybe I take my time, I use 60 or 80 and get rid of all my mill marks here. Then I jump right up to like a 120. I skip a couple of grits, or maybe 150. How am I going to be able to tell that you skipped sandpaper grits? Well, you can see with the rough sandpaper, it does leave still some scratches in there. They're noticeable. Okay, this was with my 80. If I go up to 100 and 120, it starts making those scratches smaller and smaller. If I skip a couple of grits, then those deep scratches are still going to be left in there. The other grit, the higher grit sandpaper won't be able to get it out. So you'll still see some deep scratches down in there. Now maybe you really didn't skip grits, the person didn't skip grits, but they're having, if you're seeing those deep scratches, then they didn't sand for long enough with the different grits. If you just go over it quickly, it doesn't give it enough time to fully get out all of those mill marks.